There's a famous saying I've heard being attributed to Stravinsky, Picasso, T.S. Eliot and even Steve Jobs. The saying is, "All artists borrow, but great artists steal." I've sometimes wondered whether it's one of those phrases that sounds clever but doesn't mean very much, and we'll come on to that. But I think it is true that borrowing, stealing, reusing other people's ideas is a larger part of the artistic process than is often acknowledged. We tend to impose a kind of mythical status on artists that everything is unique and original and comes down from some kind of mystical place. In reality, nothing does exist in a vacuum. We all borrow or reuse things all the time. Sometimes just one little aspect, sometimes much more. I would argue that creativity in essence is very often an act of repurposing, taking an idea from one place and sticking it in a new environment. Not reporpoising. James Dyson didn't invent a revolutionary kind of vacuum cleaner. He just saw a giant centrifugal machine that sucked the dust out of sawmills, and he thought, if I repurpose that onto a smaller scale, I'd have something useful. And you can see similar kinds of repurposing in the arts. But it's a sensitive area for artists. The line between the honest reuse of an idea and dishonest plagiarism is more blurry than you might think. There are some composers, especially in today's copyright-mad world, that have been wrongly convicted, but there may also be some long-established figures who've got away with daylight robbery. So today I want us to look over a few cases, ranging from borrowing just the smallest musical fragments, right through to reusing pretty much an entire piece. Some of our composers are long established as greats of the musical canon, including an 18th century composer who definitely seems to have taken our quotation seriously. But I'll also include some examples from living composers, and in the interests of fairness and transparency, some examples from my own work. But for the most part, I'll leave it to you to judge whether the theft is honest or dishonest, and whether the resulting composition is something great or not so great.
I always thought it would be better to be a fake somebody than a real nobody.
We'll start with an example of how you can just use the smallest idea from another composer to kickstart your own composition. I don't think many people would be too concerned about this from a moral perspective, but it's a useful benchmark for us for some of our later examples. The composer is Thomas Ades, one of the leading figures in contemporary music. Ades's music regularly references other music, and in his mazurkas for piano he reaches back to the most famous mazurka composer, Frédéric Chopin.
Mazurkas always fascinated me because they're eerie. They are, the Chopin mazurkas are strange things, and I could tell there was something happening that was not just what was directly in front of you. That music has just such a hinterland to it, such a sort of sense of mysterious spaces in the distance. It's like being in some sort of water where the bottom of the bed, seabed, is never really visible. By which I mean, the tonality is very often so far down that you're actually just swimming.
For his first mazurka, Ades cites the influence of Opus 7 No. 1, particularly a rather dissonant middle section.
The first one, is it the one that goes... but then there's an amazing... you see, that... I mean, I would say that was the first time that particular noise has been heard harmonically in a classical context. Surely it's folk music of some kind of fantastic out-of-tune drone or some, So I suppose the first place I started with this one was to have the sound. that immediately starts to slither away.
In Ades's second mazurka, the inspiration came from Chopin's Mazurka Opus 24, number 2.
Again, it seems to exist in this sort of completely outdoor harmonic space, even though you have this, which is sort of denaturing the tonic and the dominant completely, so they just become like a sort of squeeze box, and that's all it is. So you're already in this space where nothing is solid. So I thought, well, what if we say that the second beat is not there, but...
So here's a perfect example of taking an idea and placing it in a new context. He's taken a small cutting from the Chopin piece, and from that cutting his new piece has grown. And finally, in the third of the mazurkas, Ades talks about one specific sensation, a brief sense of a musical elsewhere that he heard in Chopin's Opus 7 number 4, which is a passage Ades hears as something totally separate from the rest of the piece, a sort of programmatic sound of bells in the distance.
It felt to me that narratively it's something from a novel where you hear the bells of a distant British church down the valley or something, and you think, oh, we should be there or whatever. There's something happening. Maybe I got a very fanciful idea. Maybe the girl he actually loves is actually getting married, and he's trying to forget about it by going up into the hills and dancing the mazurka. I don't know. So my one that has this section, which is like bells, a tintinnabulation of bells, and I wanted it to do something that was unrelated, apparently, to the rest of the mazurka, but then it would just simply go back into it without really asking without really answering questions that might be there.
Now this is a wonderful but also quite idiosyncratic reading of the Chopin piece. Not everyone would hear it in this way, but it's another example of inspiration being a kind of misreading that I mentioned in a recent video. It doesn't really matter if Chopin actually intended that passage to sound like bells in the distance, but Ades heard it that way, and it provided him with another seed to start his own piece. So Ades shows in the mazurkas the different ways that you can use just a moment from another piece as a starting point for your own. In the first mazurka it was a harmonic idea, in the second it was more of a melodic fragment, and in the third it was mimicking an abstract sensation, the idea of a piece being briefly interrupted by some distant musical sound. So some interesting techniques, but I don't think there's anything criminal going on here. Now let's move on to one of my own pieces, The Consolation of Rain, and I want full credit here for how embarrassing one of my sources is. I remember distinctly how this movement started. I was writing for the rather unusual combination of oboe, cello, harp and percussion, and was writing a series of kind of songs without words, but I hadn't yet found a good moment for the cello. And I remember my wife was watching some kind of music awards ceremony, maybe the Grammys or something, and as I was walking past, this song by Lana Del Rey started. Yep.
I know you, I walked with you once upon a tree.
Now the funny thing is, of course, this song itself is borrowed. It was originally written in 1959 for Disney's Sleeping Beauty, but the melody is a straight lift from a waltz from Tchaikovsky's Sleeping Beauty. I literally heard the first 3 notes of the Lana Del Rey version, and I instinctively ran out of the room before I could hear any more. The atmosphere of this kind of dark, brooding waltz felt like exactly the tone I was after, and I immediately went and wrote the opening of my own movement, which starts with 3 similar notes, but then carries on in its own way. The second borrowing aspect of this movement is something I sometimes think of as channeling. You can channel a composer or even a specific piece, and it's sort of like letting the spirit of that piece flow through you into your own.
I'm merely a vessel through which genius flows.
So in this movement I channeled one of my favourite pieces of orchestral music, Busoni's Berceuse Elegiaque, which has this gorgeous floating static quality. So there's nothing specific, no melody or harmony that is consciously borrowed from the Busoni, but the overall atmosphere is, I think, recognisable if you play them side by side. I channeled it. I think it's fair to say that Wagner takes his musical borrowing a stage further. This might seem surprising, as he's one of those composers who seems firmly in the grand Beethovenian genius school of composers. Surely he wasn't so weak and useless he had to get his ideas from elsewhere. Well, it turns out he's just the same as the rest of us. His seminal work, Tristan and Isolde, is heavily indebted to Berlioz's Romeo and Juliet. Leonard Bernstein called Wagner's piece
Tristan and Isolde is a giant metaphor of Romeo and Juliet.
Wagner actually attended the premiere of Romeo and Juliet, and he made no secret of his admiration for it. He sent Berlioz a copy of his new work with the inscription, "To the great and dear author of Romeo and Juliet, from the grateful author of Tristan and Isolde." A few side-by-side comparisons of the two works will show the kind of influence we're talking about. So we could argue that this takes the borrowing to a slightly higher plane. You get the sense that Wagner really wanted to write his own Romeo and Juliet. There's an overall channeling of a similar mood, but also the use of, at times, strikingly similar melodic phrases. It's fascinating to see, but I suspect we still haven't found enough evidence to secure a conviction.
You really think he's innocent?
That may just change with our final 3 examples. Firstly, a much larger scale paraphrase by the composer Mark Anthony Turnage. His piece, Hammered Out, was commissioned by the BBC Symphony and the LA Phil and was premiered in 2010 at the Proms. Although no mention was made in the programme note, a lot of listeners spotted an immediate similarity to nothing other than Beyoncé's Single Ladies, complete with uh-oh-ohs. And even a matching melody in the middle 8 section. Critic Alex Ross said that the piece is basically variations on a theme of Beyoncé, but to me it's closer to a kind of giant paraphrase. A pretty large chunk of the Beyoncé structure remains recognisable in the Turnage piece, to the extent that people have put up mashups of the two pieces on YouTube, and they run pretty accurately side by side. It's hard to be clear about Turnage's motivations. He mentioned before the premiere that there was some hidden reference he wanted people to discover for themselves, and I think he may have underestimated here. To call it a hidden reference to anyone who knows the Beyoncé is a bit of an understatement. And it's fascinating morally because if you accept it as an honest reworking of the Beyoncé, it's actually rather brilliant. There's some great orchestration and some really clever and creative approaches. But somehow by keeping the rather obvious reference hidden, well, some people have suspected foul play.
Is he guilty or not guilty?
Next up, it's Igor Stravinsky. And yes, that is an actual mugshot of Stravinsky, although disappointingly he wasn't actually arrested for altering the chords to the Star-Spangled Banner, as is often reported. This was just a photo that was taken for a visa application. If you thought that Turnage's use of both the structure and a lot of similar melodic content is as close to the edge as we can get in terms of honest stealing, well, consider a work like Stravinsky's Pulcinella. For this piece, Stravinsky took various pieces he thought were by the 18th century Italian composer Pergolesi, although scholars later realised many of them were actually by other composers. And he created what amounts to an entirely new form of composition, somewhere between orchestration and original composition. Stravinsky memorably described his process of working directly on copies of the original manuscripts, as though I were correcting an old work of my own. Whole passages remain largely unchanged from the original. Others keep the melody and add in just a little unexpected tweak, like say a cross rhythm or a quirky instrumental combination. In fact, it's an approach which particularly highlights the importance of instrumental colour in giving personality to music. So much of the piece sounds Stravinskian simply by virtue of the instruments chosen. And in a way it shows a composer at the heights of his confidence, completely unencumbered by any fears or doubts about his own originality. Instead, it's simply an artist at play, finding some music he likes and saying, "What can I do with this?" But it's perhaps most shocking in the lack of reverence it shows to the original source. It doesn't feel morally questionable because the sources are openly acknowledged even if he got them wrong. But listening to Pulcinella even today, we're faced with questions about art and originality that aren't easy to answer. And these are questions that Stravinsky continued to ask throughout his life. Take the less well-known Fairy's Kiss from 1928, written as a homage to one of Stravinsky's musical heroes, Tchaikovsky. Some parts of the piece are based on early Tchaikovsky piano pieces, and it makes for a fascinating picture of how Stravinsky could work with other people's material. Take this rather charming waltz from the original Tchaikovsky. There's a noticeable harmonic change around here. The harmony veers away from the simplicity of the opening to a more Austro-Germanic functional harmony. And it's exactly at this point that Stravinsky veers away from his source. He's not interested in functional harmony. It's more the street tradition of the organ grinder or the squeeze box that he's trying to capture. So he recreates the end of this tune with a simple answering phrase, whilst at the same time, with typical Stravinskyan sorcery, gently slipping the gears below using the wrong bass notes. Sometimes the line between source and sorcery is even more puzzling. So can you tell in this example which of these two versions are Stravinsky and which is Tchaikovsky? I would say that the first example sounds a bit more bitonal, with a strong emphasis on that E clashing with the overall D major. But this is actually the Tchaikovsky original. Stravinsky, for reasons that are not entirely clear, shifts the whole thing a fourth lower, making it less bitonal, less Stravinskyan than the Tchaikovsky. And again, it's only really when you add in the orchestration with quirky clucking horn textures over the staccato bassoons that you really hear it as pure Stravinsky. I think it's fair to say that Stravinsky was one of the composers who started a very 20th century process of diluting the boundaries of artistic integrity. His work is an acknowledgement of the way art comes from other art, and something of a refutation of the Romantic era myth of the artistic work as something finite and indestructible. Stravinsky shows that even reusing entire works is possible and even interesting, as long as your own artistic personality is strong enough to make it so. Our final example, though, is more of an unsolved case, a composer who regularly borrowed melodies from other composers without acknowledgement. Indeed, Gramophone magazine discussed how much we know about this composer's borrowings, but that his motivation for making them is a formidable enigma. Is this a diplomatic way of saying that we have a true thief on our hands? So we're talking about George Frederick Handel, and here's a melody from his cantata La Resurrezione. Only it's actually a melody from the opera Octavia by Reinhard Keiser, for whom Handel had worked when he was living in Germany several years before. There are also other passages in the same piece that come from different sources, and other pieces of Handel that use other melodies from this same Keiser opera. These are just a couple of the more prominent ones, but there are very many other examples throughout Handel's career. Now, unpicking Handel's motivations, especially at this historical remove, is extremely difficult. Could it be, for example, that this was just a way of honouring his former employer? Certainly not everyone thinks so. The 19th century scholar Sedley Taylor said, "The similarities are too minute and extensive to be accounted for, either by fortuitous coincidence or by unconscious reminiscence. He accepted, indeed practically claimed merit for what he must have known was not his own work." Whereas Handel's biographer was far more charitable. It was the impulse of his artistic nature to save from oblivion musical ideas that he saw lying half-formed and not coincidentally in an alien setting. At this point it's worth returning to our original quote, "All artists borrow, but great artists steal." I mentioned that there were several suggestions of who actually said it. As far as I can tell, it seems to have been T.S. Eliot who was the first to say something like this. The others, somewhat ironically, seem to have borrowed his phrase and, in the process, garbled the original meaning. So here's what T.S. Eliot said in full. "Immature poets imitate, mature poets steal. Bad poets deface what they take, and good poets make it into something better, or at least something different. The good poet welds his theft into a whole of feeling which is unique, utterly different than that from which it is torn." So I was going to end by saying that we can conclude that all artists borrow in all sorts of ways, some small, some surprisingly large. And that the idea of stealing that Eliot talks about is not really anything fundamentally immoral. But Handel's case seems to cast some doubt on this idea. There's no doubt he did write many, many pieces which have stood the test of time and whose authenticity has never been questioned. But he also seems to have had a practice of quite regularly using other people's work without any kind of acknowledgement. which at the very least seems a little bit undignified. So was he genuinely a composer who was so powerful, whose own status was just so high that he could just literally steal an idea and pass it off as his own? Or was he just the same as many of the other examples from Stravinsky to Ades, where the composer simply uses another composer's idea as a trigger for their own imagination? I'm not sure, but please do let me know what you think in the comments. And if you enjoyed this kind of video, do please make an honest composer out of me by joining my patrons over at Patreon. I couldn't carry on making these videos without you. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.